Hello and welcome to the special RPOA Economic Update. One of the RPOA's goals during this coronavirus pandemic is to keep you as up to date as possible with information that will help you survive and thrive as real estate investors. That's why I'm so excited to be talking with today's guest about the economic impact this pandemic is going to have on our real estate investments. If you've been looking for real data on our city, state, and country's economic strength, and what all this means for your real estate portfolio, then you're definitely going to want to hear this economic forecast with Paul Isely. Paul is the Associate Dean and Economist for Undergraduate Programs in the Seidman College of Business at Grand Valley State University. If you've ever been to the RPOA's annual conference, then you already know that Paul is the most popular speaker by far. This year, his presentation was standing room only, and his economic forecast was incredibly eye-opening. Now, we're recording this on Tuesday, April 28th. And Paul, it's great to have you here with us and sharing your latest economic data and forecast.
Nice to be here.
When you spoke at the end of February, I believe it was February 28th, at the RPOA annual conference, you shared with us that as far as manufacturing goes in Michigan, we were already in a recession at that point. And coronavirus was on the horizon. We did not know how bad it was going to get. And you said at the time, in the next 2 weeks, we'll have a much clearer picture of how bad it's going to get. Well, now 2 months later, after that presentation, here we are talking. How bad is it going to get?
The short answer is that in the short run, very, very bad. In fact, as we look here at April, it will probably be our worst April since data was really kept. So we're really looking at a pretty bad beginning to all of this. And in fact, by the time we reach the middle of March versus the end of March, the impacts that we were seeing doubled in size over that time. So it went from almost no impact in February to doubling every 2 weeks for a little while. So I have a couple graphs that can help you see that and help you see how that's impacted the economy. So what happened as we went into March, as we left the meeting at the end of February, was that by the middle of March, most states had started to restrict gatherings and going out to eat and those types of things. And by the end of the month, the vast majority of states had some level of stay-at-home order in place. They called it different things, but it was all about the same. But there were different ways that they implemented that. So, for instance, when you think about housing, only 20% of the states effectively list construction as non-essential, such as Michigan does. The vast majority were allowing that to still continue to go on. By the time we got into April, the most common ending date for those stay-at-home orders was April 30th. All right. But those have been shifting back and going into May and going into June and some even into July now. So it's starting to change and go in that direction. So as we look at Europe, we can see that they're starting to gradually phase their economy back in. So we're starting to see some lessons there. So what I want to do is provide a few slides for you to see what's happening. So as we look at the United States, as we ended March, there was a drastic effect on retail. And we saw clothing retail drop by 50%. We saw spending on furniture in restaurants and bars and motor vehicles and sporting goods all drop by about 25%. And where people were spending their money was running to the grocery store to buy food and supplies for the next month. What we can see is those things that drive the Michigan economy, furniture, restaurants and bars, motor vehicles, all got hit very, very hard in March. And we were only really closed down for a week and only really slowed down for 2 weeks. So as we start to look at that, as we go into April, and as we're getting towards the end of April, we want to look at how that affects things like automotive sales. So those two orange bars, you can see that we have the annual sales rate for automobiles in 1982 and 2009. Which are two recent relatively large recessions. And you can see the annualized rate of sales had dropped to just north of 10 million units a year. In February, our annualized rate was above 16 million units. By March, it had dropped to just over 11 million units. And we're projecting just north of 8 million units for April as we looking at things right now. We'll know in a week. That would make April the worst month since the series began in 1976 for automotive sales. So for the state of Michigan, that's a very troubling number.
To me, it's even surprising that people were buying or selling cars at all in April.
What we found was that the first 2 weeks, there was a big shock pattern. So we saw that both in things like cars and things like real estate, where things ground pretty much to a halt for a little while. But remember, even looking at the large unemployment rates that we're looking at, we're still looking at a large proportion of the United States still being employed. We're still looking at a large percentage of the United States outside of the states that have had large clusters, still allowing automotive sales. And we still allow automotive sales here in Michigan. So people reach a point where they need a new car, they're going to buy a car. And we're seeing that happen right now. They're more cautious about it. They're only doing it if they really need to do it. They may be choosing a car that doesn't have as many high-end specs as they would have 2 months ago. But they're still going out and buying cars, just at a substantially reduced rate.
Projecting that out, it doesn't look like it's going to get any better for a while.
Well, I think as we start going into May and June, that's when we're going to be looking very carefully at these numbers. The reason that we're going to look very carefully at these numbers is we've never had a shutdown like this before. And the longer that it lasts, the longer that the economy is stay at home with very few businesses open, the more real damage it's doing to businesses. So it's bleeding their capital and their ability to come back quickly on the other side. So we're watching that very carefully, but we expect that you'll see some of these numbers start to rebound off of these lows. And we expect that April, maybe May, will be the worst months of all of this. So we expect it to trend better as we get out of the spring here. And you can already see that with the new unemployment claims data. On the left-hand side there, you see the unemployment claims graph, and you can for Michigan. And if you actually use it for the United States, the graph would follow the same pattern. All right, and you can see that for Michigan, it peaked that first week in April with almost 400,000 new claims. To help you understand that a little better and put it into context, 2009 was an awful recession year, one of the worst in memory. And people call it the Great Recession because of that. There's a light red line that you can see between 50,000 and 100,000 on this graph. That light red line is the worst week during that recession. So you can see that this is many times worse than the worst week that we saw in the last recession. But you can see that a large number of people lost jobs right away, and then they had to get their unemployment claims through the process. And now that we're starting to get towards all of those initial claims, we're seeing those claims drop, and we'll continue to see those new claims drop into what would be a normal recession pattern over the next few weeks.
Just to be clear, this chart is it's unemployment claims each week, as opposed to just the unemployment rate, which is the number
Correct.
of people who are actually unemployed.
Correct. What we're looking at right now is for the week of 4/18, when the data actually is calculated, which won't be for another week yet. It's expected that the insured unemployment rate will be near 22%, which means the overall unemployment rate will be around 20 to 25% in the state of Michigan.
That's an incredibly drastic rate there.
It is stunning. We've never seen anything this drastic in the U.S. economy since modern data has been kept. We've never seen the entire country basically shut down half of the economy in less than 2 weeks, which is really what we're seeing happen here in the United States. That's a big number. It's going to have damage and lasting damage. And the longer we have the shutdown, the more lasting that damage is, and the longer this recession will last.
It looks like we have an inverted V there as far as jobless claims. Do you think we're going to see that same inverted V as far as unemployment rate?
No, I do think that April, May will probably be the highest unemployment that we'll see. That might carry into the June number because the numbers are actually calculated near the beginning of the month. But I think we're reaching peak unemployment here in May, and that unemployment then will drift lower after that point. How fast it comes back is going to be a function of several different things that we're going to have to be watching.
Do we have any indication from overseas where the pandemic hit a lot earlier? Are we seeing indication from them or data that will help us forecast what we're going to look like in the coming months here?
Yeah, I mean, what we see is Northern Europe is about 3 weeks ahead of us. And so we're able to see how they're reopening their economy. And we're seeing that they're taking baby steps to reopen their economy, a little bit like what Michigan and Wisconsin have done over the last week, where they've opened up small parts of their economy to start testing the waters. So we're seeing that happen. We're seeing places like South Korea, which really was able to avoid major shutdowns by doing much more testing than we've done here in the United States. So they were able to stay ahead of it a little bit and keep those hot spots from rising like we saw in New York City and Detroit here in the United States. So what we expect is once we tamp this down to a manageable level, that we'll be able to bring the economy back online in stages and keep the virus from getting out of control by using testing and contact tracing to keep it from firing up like we saw in those major cities earlier this month.
Do you have the insight into the testing and contact tracing to know whether that's going to be effective or whether that's ready to go yet in this country?
Well, we're still not quite to where we need to be on testing. My calculations show that here in Michigan, we've doubled the amount of testing that we were doing just a few weeks ago, and we need to double it again in order to be able to do effective contact tracing. We're hoping and we're optimistic that that will happen. We've certainly seen the public health people and the medical people starting to get ahead of this a little bit. And as they do that, our ability to stay ahead of the virus a little bit will still be there. I'm not saying we're getting rid of the virus. The virus isn't going to go away. The shutting down the economy and the stay-at-home orders, if you remember, was all about flattening the curve. It's about reducing it so that our peaks of this virus occur at a level that is manageable by our healthcare system. So here in Michigan, we've seen the number of people who are sick enough that they need to be on a ventilator drop from over 1,400, if I'm remembering right. Well, it's nearly halved since April 10th. So we've seen a big drop in the number of people who are needing that. And that's good news because it means that we now have capacity to start opening the economy a little bit. And we're not going to be in danger of over-revving the hospital sector here in Michigan.
I'm curious with the data that you're looking at, and I know that all this is pretty up to date. Are you seeing things that go against the conventional wisdom we're hearing in the media or in the political sphere?
Well, I want to caution you that I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm an economist. But I am looking at different states to try and understand where our limits are and what we need to see. If we look at those hospitalizations as opposed to those positives go up and down because of the amount of testing being done and those types of things. If we look at the number of people who are needing a ventilator because they've become that sick, we can see that Indiana has also essentially halved theirs. We can see Louisiana has essentially halved theirs. We can see in Iowa, they never had the big surge that we have, and they've stayed pretty flat. All right, they're starting to drift up a little bit. What that tells me is all four of those states, Michigan, Indiana, Louisiana, and Iowa, all had different stay-at-home orders that allowed different levels of contact. And what we're learning from all of this is that that level of contact, once we get it under control in Michigan, can be much higher than what we have it right now, and still be able to keep the virus under control.
Are you saying that the data is telling you that it's okay now to maybe loosen up on some of the restrictions and open up some of the businesses?
I'm saying that it's moving in that direction and that we have to listen to our healthcare providers. But I am saying that the data is suggesting at this point that If we're not there, we're getting close to being able to do that if we have the testing in place.
I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of the economy overall. How much longer do you think we're going to be in this downward spiral? Are you able to look at the data, and does it tell you at all when we might start pulling out of this economically?
If you look at what I'm forecasting, and if you're looking at what others forecasting for this, like the Congressional Budget Office, the RSQE out of University of Michigan, most are pretty much now dialing in at how bad the front end of this is going to be. Across the United States, we're starting to see a lot more consensus about the worst of this is going to be April, May, maybe June. And then the question is how fast you come back from that. Now, when we were looking at this as maybe being 4 weeks worth of shutdown, there was a lot of hope that we would see a V. And so we would come down and we'd go up and it would be a V. It's not 4 weeks, it's 8 weeks. And we know 8 weeks results in more businesses running out of capital to a point where they will not be able to come back when the economy restarts. So we're now creating lasting damage that will cause this recession to last longer than what that V looks like. But we're still looking at how fast do we come back? What does it really look like as we come out the other side? So if you think about what we're seeing here in Michigan, so last Friday we allowed certain businesses to reopen, allowed lawn care, we allowed more pickups at stores, allowed more recreational activities, brought back painting and being able to stop and get gardening materials at your big box stores. So you have more things, more bigger part of the economy that's coming back together. We're also seeing that the UAW has, the automakers are discussing how to restart the factories. And they're already bringing back teams to get those factories ready to restart again. That's really looking at a 2 to 3 week timeline for us to start to see some level of manufacturing really start to rekindle here in Michigan. That's a big deal because that's where we're losing the most value in our economy right now.
The country's economy or Michigan's economy?
Michigan's economy, and actually US-wide, it's a big chunk of it. For the rest of the United States, entertainment and transportation are a bigger part of their economy than they are here in Michigan. Here, manufacturing is a larger part. So we know something. We know manufacturing can come back a little bit faster. The reason that it can, and construction can come back a little bit faster. The reason those two things can come back a little faster is because it's easier to maintain social distancing. It's easier to control the environment in which the people are working, control who your contacts are as you're working. We expected lawn care to come back first. It did. We expect construction, particularly outdoor construction, to come back. It's already back in 80% of the states. We expect in those other states we'll start to see it to come back. And we expect that manufacturing will come back before we start to see those retail and restaurant type components. The trick from a public health point of view is you want to do that in stages. All right. It means that you want in Michigan 50 to 100,000 people to go back to work. And then you want to give it a week or two and see, hey, did we see a spike in number of cases? Did we rekindle a hot spot that we need to deal with? Or are we okay? And once you get that data, you say, okay, let's bring another 50 to 100,000 people back to work, and then another 50 to 100,000. And so it's going to be in stages because of the public health side of this. But the places that are going to come back first are those places that we can maintain that social distancing the easiest. So that's good news for that side. It's bad news for restaurants, bars, and places that depend on large groups of people to come. Restaurants and bars have gotten much better at pickup. We've seen that number trend up all the way through April. It bottomed out right at the beginning of April, and all the way through April, the credit card data is showing that people are going out to eat more again. So they're running and picking up food someplace. And anecdotally, I can say that when I've gone to pick up food, there's now 10 or 15 cars waiting for someone to come running out with a bag of food. So restaurants are being able to do that, but that does not replace their sit-down restaurant world. So we expect that that's where we'll see even more bankruptcies than than we're going to see other places, are those types of industries.
Paul, I'd like to turn the conversation to real estate now, and get your sense, starting on the wider U.S. Level, and then working our way down to the state of Michigan and Grand Rapids or West Michigan, where we are. On the U.S. side of real estate, what is the state of real estate?
I mean, we certainly saw it slow down, and it's a little too early to really declare because we really only have 3 weeks worth of data. But we certainly can see a marked slowdown happening. Remember, a lot of real estate data, particularly sales data, is marked with when it actually closes. We saw real estate drop considerably in March by 8%, 9%, between 8 and 9%.
Now, are you talking about single-family home sales?
Single-family home sales. So we saw that drop by 8 to 9% in March. But a lot of those were closings that had been put in place late February, early March. March wasn't a good number for us yet. We really need to see April, which is when the full bite will have taken place. And we'll get that data, and we've been getting that data slowly now. So there's certain things that we know. As we look at rentals, and we look at rental as we went into this, there was a lot of fear as to how big of an issue this would be with people making rental payments. People remember 2008, 2009, when we had a big dip in people's ability to pay for the goods that they needed to buy, such as paying their rent. Okay, so as we went into April and we got the data for those April 1st rental payments, what we saw nationwide was, depending on which survey you looked at, 60 to 70% made their payment, and only 30 to 40% missed a payment or made a partial payment. Okay. Here in West Michigan, 76% made their full payment, and another 7% made a partial payment. So West Michigan was performing just a little bit better than the rest of the United States. One of the things that we have to understand about this recession is the fiscal policy, the spending by the government, happened very early in the process. So what we have is, right at the very beginning of the recession, in the first 3 or 4 weeks here in Michigan, we have 1 million people filing for unemployment. And nationwide, we're looking at close to 10 million people applying for unemployment. Why does this matter? Here in West Michigan, if you look at the people who lost their jobs, 60% of those people, by loose calculations, actually will make more money on unemployment than they did working. If you qualify for unemployment benefits, you get $600 above what the state is giving a week. Plus you're getting your stimulus check. That comes out to about $45,000 a year in income for an individual, or $90,000 a year for 2 people, plus the stimulus check on top of that. And all of that money is hitting right around May. So we really are looking at May being better than the beginning of April was, because those people started to apply for unemployment near the beginning of April, but they hadn't started to receive income yet. Now in the second half of April, we're seeing that income come, and we're seeing checks come to back that up, and we're starting to see some people go back to work. So we really expect that people will have income to pay for their rentals, particularly in people who are in non-luxury areas. It shouldn't be a problem to make a rent payment as we go into May. They may be scared to make a rent payment. They may want to try and save money in case this goes long. But they receive that extra payment through June. So we're really looking at for the next 2 months, we have an opportunity that if the economy starts to pick up, that it won't be so bad on the rental side as what we saw in 2008, 2009.
Do you anticipate there being more fiscal stimulus to help people along the way?
There's going to be more fiscal stimulus. at this point, because the fiscal stimulus that we created here was designed around a V recession, one where we closed down for 4 weeks and then we started to restart for a month, and then the economy was sort of back on track. So they pumped in enough stimulus to get us through June, and they're going to in an election year, they're not going to want to see very many voters hurting. So they're going to find a way to borrow from the future to give them more security right now, so that there's a better chance that they get reelected. We firmly believe that there'll be more stimulus tranches as we go into summer.
What other data do you have, Paul, that applies to real estate, the real estate investors that would be listening to this show?
That's the rental side. So let's do the mortgage side. We saw single-family home sales in March drop by between 8 and 9%. All right, across the United States. And by the end of the month, it became hard to even show houses because of the stay-at-home orders. We really expect that April will be one of the worst months we have for single-family sales. And that will start to create a drag on prices, particularly on upper-end prices. But we saw a second thing happen. We saw people pull their houses off the market. And they did that because they expected their prices to go down a little bit, thought that they would wait for the other side of this to sell, or they're now unsure about their own situation and can't trade up to that next house, so they're going to stay put for right now. So we've also seen a decrease on the supply side. So we saw both of those things happen. Now, what we're hearing from realtors as we go through the month is that people are starting to become more comfortable with virtual tours, and that the amount of action in that market has started to drift upwards as we went through April, which is what we're seeing in every single market, whether it be real estate, whether it be automobiles, whether it be retail. The people had that shock and awe at the beginning of April, and now they're taking a step back and saying, yeah, it's bad, but I got to move, and I got to do it. So we're starting to see a little bit more action again on that. We know that interest rates, although they struggled a little bit there in March as there were some liquidity constraints, have really reached some pretty nice lows right now. So we know the interest rates are pretty low, and we know that they're going to stay low for the rest of this year. So that's going to be helpful as well for those people who kept their jobs. They're going to be looking for bargains in houses as soon as they start to feel the economy is coming back. We expect that the unemployment rate is going to peak out in May and April, and then it's going to drop radically as you start getting numbers into the summer. Okay, it's still going to be elevated. There's still going to be too many people without jobs, but it's going to be much, much less than what we saw here in April. So the pain is really April, maybe a little bit of May, and then it will be slow improvement as we go through the summer.
Paul, is there anything in the data that tells you whether housing prices are going to stay steady, or are we going to see a drop or maybe an increase for some reason?
We're still waiting completely because we saw both a drop in demand and a drop in supply. If we hadn't seen both of those, then we would expect the drop in demand would have caused prices start to drift lower. Okay, so we do know that there's less competition, there's less upward pressure on prices, because there's fewer people competing for houses. We do expect the prices to come down. I'm just now starting to get data where we can do this. Because remember, house sales data is really put into the system when the close happens. So closings that we're having right now really are sales from almost a month ago. So we really need to get into May before we really start to feel out what the change or whether there's a big change there. The anecdotal evidence we get from talking to people is that there's been less price pressure. There's been less competition to bid that price up. And that's going to lead to housing prices cooling. Now, here in West Michigan, what we expect is that will cool a little bit as we go through this summer, but it's going to create pent-up demand for next summer. And given the demographics of the number of millennials who are trying to transition to houses, it really suggests that it will be a weak summer this year, followed by a strong summer next year. if the economy plays out the way most economists are expecting right now.
Given that, if you're a millennial looking to buy a house in West Michigan or anywhere in the country, with the low interest rates that we have right now and the lack of competition, would this be a great time for millennials to be actually buying a house?
Yeah, I think right now is a pretty good time to get out there and look and see what you can't get, provided that you're pretty secure in your economic situation. And there's certain industries where you're going to feel secure and certain industries where you're not going to feel secure. But there's a lot of indications that, if you're young, you have a lot of time to make up for a mistake. And so if you're in a situation where you were planning on doing it, your economic situation hasn't eroded, by the time we reach June, you're going to start to feel whether the economy is starting to warm up a little bit, or whether you need to keep powder dry for next year.
One of the underlying currents that I'm concerned about is the mortgage market. Not only are people supposedly having trouble paying their rents, which we see in the decrease in rent payments in April, but homeowners and borrowers are also having difficulty paying on their loans, whether it be a mortgage, a credit card debt. So we have all this debt out there. And I'm wondering if you see any problems on the horizon, looking at the data that you look at that tells you, okay, that's something that could come along and cause its own set of issues.
Yeah, we're certainly starting to see transition to 30 days late rise. I think that some of the stimulus will also affect and make it possible for mortgage holders to pay their mortgage for a few months here, or at least try and stay up on it. A lot of mortgage holders have the ability or have been given the right to defer that mortgage payment for several months. That's a dangerous game unless you absolutely need it, since you still have to pay when you get to the end. For most people, it's better to try and stay up with it if you can. Here's the bad news. Yes, we will see more foreclosures. It's not going to look like 2008, 2007 foreclosure time. All right. It's not going to look like that. Because we haven't seen the erosion in personal wealth that we saw last time. The last recession really was because of the financial system not being able to work, primarily because of over excesses in the real estate market. We don't have those same pressures now. The banks are in good shape. The Federal Reserve is on it immediately and has tools that they've already developed to help make sure that market continues to work. We have consumers that are getting good unemployment benefits in many cases right at the very beginning. So it's not going to look anything like the last time we did this. But we will see a raise in foreclosures, and we will see a raise in troubled loans as we start to move into summer. And that's going to create some hiccups there. What I'm more worried about is 2 to 3 to 4 years from now. Okay, as we start looking at the medium term, we're looking at the federal government basically borrowing an extra $3 trillion on the future. And we're seeing firms need to borrow money in order to bridge this gap. So that's putting a lot of pressure on interest rates, particularly longer term interest rates, to start going up. Will they go up? It will depend on a lot of different things. But the pressure is up on long-term interest rates once we get past these initial stimulus time. We're really looking for a higher interest rate environment as we move out into that medium-term horizon than we were expecting before. And that will make it more troublesome as we start to look at that as we reach the middle to end of this decade.
It really does seem like we're taking on an extraordinary amount of debt above and beyond the extraordinary amount of debt that we already had in our system.
What we have more than a debt problem is a spending problem. Taking debt to try and help during an extraordinary downturn is okay. So if you think about it at a personal level, it's okay to borrow if it's good debt versus bad debt. You don't buy it to extend your consumption. You borrow in order to invest. And so if you're investing and you're creating value, that borrowing money will generate enough value to pay for that debt. So what we're doing right now is we're dumping money into the economy. We're doing it very fast. We're going to make mistakes about it. You're going to see news, so-and-so got money and they shouldn't have gotten money. And these people are being overpaid. And this happened. And this person didn't. There's going to be mistakes because of the amount of money we're dumping in. But what that's going to do is make sure that we don't have to claw out of as deep of a hole when we come out of the other side of this. And so that's good money because it's going to mean that we have an ability to restart the economy and creating value sooner. Where our problem is we have systemic debt where we are spending money, it's hard-coded in, and it's beyond what our tax base as we currently have can support into the future. All right. We need to make hard decisions about those things and how we're going to handle those things. And there's been no political will to do that. So as economists look at this, we really get worried about 10 years from now when those systemic spending meets those large debt loads and drives up our borrowing costs to a point where it's hard for the economy to grow. We're not there yet. We have a little bit of breathing room. The good news is we still have time to fix it. The bad news is the longer we wait, the harder it's going to be. And because we have time, it's hard for politicians to feel the sense of urgency to fix it.
So I want to turn our attention to other types of real estate. Do you have data that tells us about these other asset classes? Starting with commercial multifamily and apartments.
Commercial multifamily. The data is still early days on that. And particularly since commercial construction particularly has such a lag. So we'll be well into this recession by the time the pipeline of work already in progress for commercial starts to dry up. But what we do know is that funding is going to be harder to come by. And that we do know we've started to see some commercial entities move away from deals that they were planning on. So the early anecdotal evidence on this says that it's the commercial side that's going to start to take a hit on this. Think about this. With commercial, a lot of commercial, even commercial residential, is multi-use and has retail space. Just the fact that almost everyone has had to learn to buy almost everything online over the last 4 weeks. So even people who would normally go to the store are being forced to buy stuff online and learn how to do that. That's going to accelerate that online movement that's already been happening. All right. That's going to make some of that income off of those properties less viable. Banks know that. So getting financing for that is going to drop. And it's going to make it harder to do. We also are going to have a smaller group of people able to afford those higher end amenities. And we've spent a lot of time producing those higher end rental properties in the multifamily space in recent years. Certainly for the next 2 years, those are going to be harder for people to maintain, and they're going to be looking to downsize or get to lower monthly spending if one of their family members has lost the job or they've had to move to a job that pays less. So all of that tells us on the commercial side, we expect a bit of weakening now as we go into this year, and that will actually probably accelerate a little bit more in the second half of the year than what we see.
I've heard anecdotally different perspectives on that. You're saying that at the higher end, like the newer build that charges the higher rents, you're going to see pressure there because people are going to need to downsize, cut their costs as maybe their jobs change. I've also heard the other side of that the people who are losing their jobs and the high unemployment rate that we're going to see is going to affect more of the lower income working class apartments.
Mm-hmm. So we know the people who are going to be unemployed the longest in this recession are the people who deal with touch services. So restaurants, venues, transportation, and we know that those people are on the lower end of the spectrum as far as income goes. We know that the aid packages that are coming through are going to support that group through the next 2 to 4 months without a huge amount of problems, okay, in the Midwest. Now, if you're on the coast, that extra $600 isn't enough to make up the difference. But here in the Midwest, that extra $600 is a big deal every week. So here it's going to be probably delay that problem for several months. And we're going to have some time for the economy to come back a little bit and for those people to actually find different jobs. What we're actually seeing from business side is they're actually worried that workers aren't going to want to come back to work because they're being paid so much on unemployment. So here in Michigan, if you were getting on the top end of that unemployment checks, you're getting more than $20 an hour. There are very few jobs in the hospitality sector that pay $20 an hour. Those workers are going to want to not come back to work as long as possible to receive that higher income. That's one of the things that we're looking at that could draw this recession on longer because of that desire to not be employed because you're making more money. So yeah, I think that's an issue. But really what we have is something that's slushing around. If we look here in West Michigan, over the last few years, we've built a lot of multifamily. It's created a little bit of space in the rental world here. It's gotten a little bit, it's created a little bit of slush room. That slush room, as we were looking at the end of last year, the beginning of this year, was hurting the bottom end of the market because everybody's incomes were going up well enough that those people were transitioning into slightly better product. And the people on the bottom were having to drop prices in order to convince people to come in. So that's what we were hearing anecdotally as we talked to many people across the city here in Grand Rapids. What we have now is if people have to downsize, they're going to come down and come into that slush. So I think the very bottom of the market is always going to have problems at this point. I think the very top of the market wasn't having a lot of problems and is going to have more problems because of this.
So talking about the West Michigan market, how does it differ from what's going on in the rest of the state of Michigan and also the country?
So here in West Michigan, we have a couple things that are happening for us that are really good. Number one is we have a lot of young people. So we have more people between the ages of 25 and 35 than we do over the age of 65. That's a big deal. That's a lot of momentum in a housing market and in a rental market because those are people coming up through the system. They're going to buy, they're going to sell, they're going to try and move around within the real estate sector. All right. The rest of the state doesn't have that. The rest of the state has more people over 65 than they have between 25 and 35. They don't have that young money coming into the system, which is really driving that lower end of the market to higher prices, which are giving people in that part of the market more money to upsize and go to the next level. And because of the success in West Michigan, we're drawing more people into West Michigan. So people are choosing to move here from other states and choosing to move here from other parts of the state because of the opportunities that exist here. We're going to continue to see better opportunities here as we come out of this recession than we see elsewhere. And that's going to continue to drive people to come here to find their next job, and they're going to have to find someplace to live while they're here. That's the demographic dynamic that's really driving the market here in Grand Rapids. We've also seen incomes rise faster here in West Michigan than we've seen in the rest of the country. Part of this is our wages were behind. So in order to compete with workers with other areas of the country, we had to raise our wages faster than they were. But the good side of that is that people who are already here now have higher incomes than they had before, and they may want to invest in something in real estate. All of that leads to a stronger market here, and it's one of the reasons why we see a faster end, particularly for real estate here in West Michigan, than we see in other parts of the state.
Paul, as we wrap it up, I'm wondering if there's any questions I haven't asked you or any data that you think is important to this conversation that you'd like to share with our listeners.
So I want to remind people all of this is predicated on what type of recession we really have. So right now we're looking at two different types of recessions. Both of them, we sort of know the beginning has an unemployment rate in Michigan nearing 25%. And really peaking out as we hit the beginning of May, end of April. Okay, and that we should start to see that unemployment rate drop as we move through summer. Now, as we restart the economy, the question will be how fast can we restart the economy without the virus returning? And how fast can we restart the economy in a way that consumers actually want to buy the stuff that we're making? Our best case scenario right now says that when we get to the end of the year and we look back, April will be a disaster. But the year as a whole will feel an awful lot like 2009. That's our best case scenario. And that's one where we're steadily able to reopen the economy. We see it constantly reopening, and we don't see the virus come back in waves where we have to do targeted shutdowns and things like that. Now, the worst case scenario is consumers aren't ready to come back. It's hard to get people to come back to work. The virus comes back, and we start to see waves of viruses happen during the course of the year where we have to restart the economy several times. Okay, not in the same way as we've had to here at the beginning, but they would likely be more targeted. In running those models several different ways, we're seeing that type of recession starts to be almost double what we saw in 2000. So the question that we have sitting where we are is, which side are you going to be on? And so what I'm telling people is you need to look at two different data points and pay really close attention to them. The first one is the virus side. All right. You need to be watching the states that open up early. There's several that are opening up early now, and see how does the virus behave there 14 to 21 days later. That will tell us whether they're opening too fast, too slow. And if the virus doesn't resurge, if they continue to have it under control, then it suggests that we can open up a little bit faster. It will also start to give consumers confidence that the virus is going to get under control. If those states start to see images like we saw out of New York City or out of Detroit, that's going to draw this recession out. So over the course of the next 3 weeks, we're going to see lots of openings. And you got to look 2 to 3 weeks down the road is when you'll see whether that rekindles the virus in those areas. Be watching for that really carefully. If you see it rekindle, be counting on this recession lasting into next summer. And if you don't see it rekindle, then next summer is going to be really people starting to feel much better and moving on and the economy getting better. The other thing that you need to look at is consumer confidence. The Conference Board and University of Michigan both put out consumer confidence numbers. And we saw a big drop in that consumer confidence in April. We went from being around 100 on the U of M index in February to being 70 in April, at least preliminarily. But when they asked the people, why is this the case? Almost all of them, well, a large proportion of them, referenced they were worried about getting sick because of the virus. A small number, given the depth of damage to the economy, referenced their finances at all. So a lot of people were feeling that their finances weren't a problem yet as we were going into April. They were really worried about getting sick. So if we can start to restart the economy and the virus starts to disappear, it's possible that consumer confidence will come back much faster than what we expect. So we need to be looking at that number. So if you see that consumer confidence number start to get into the mid-80s and start to move up as opposed to going down, then we're also in case where we're going to be moving much faster as opposed to much slower on the tail. As you listen to economists, including me, none of us know how the tail is going to look yet because we've never seen anything like this to model before. So it's really important to look at those markers because those are the markers that will tell you whether the tail is going to be fast and we're going to get out of this as we exit this year, or whether it's going to bleed into next summer and continue to be a problem.
Paul, this has been a great conversation. I really want to thank you for taking the time to share your data with us. Thank you so much for being here today and talking with us.
My pleasure. I can say that my forecast in February was too optimistic because we did not know that this was going to be this level of a problem.
Yeah, it's very interesting that there we were at the RPOA annual conference, probably there must have been 250 people in the room listening to you at the end of February. And 2 weeks later, shut down the whole state. So,
Yeah. Well, I did say at the meeting that if this was still our headline in 3 weeks, hold on tight because we're going to have a good recession. Not only was it still there 3 weeks, but it's still there 2 months from then. It's still our number one topic. So that tells you the amount of damage that's happening.
But here we are. Thank you so much. This was great.